Thank you for making the time to be here and for what I'm sure will be an incredibly engaging afternoon of conversation. So I'm Mia. My primary role is your moderator today. My only real qualification is that I'm a daily correspondent from my living room. That's a joke. Sorry. I just look at the world and I'm like, what are we doing? But I also have a history as a feminist activist organizer. And I'm an acupuncturist, so that's actually my contribution to currently how we support and heal each other and support this work moving forward. But more importantly, I have the distinct honor and pleasure of introducing you to Meredith and Debbie. First, we're going to hear a bit from them, and then I'll pose a few questions to them, and then we'll open it up for questions from you all, okay? So Meredith Tax has been a feminist all her life and an organizer and writer since the late 60s. Her books include A History, The Rising of Women, Feminist Solidarity and Class Conflict, 1880 to 1917, two novels, Rivington Street and Union Square, and Families. She's recently published articles in the New York Times, The Nation, Dissent, Foreign Affairs, and Open Democracy 50/50. In the 80s, she began to do international work on free speech issues affecting women not only in the US, but in Africa, Latin America, the Middle East, and South Asia. This led to a focus on the rise of violent, racist, and misogynist right-wing movements that use religion as their entry point, but whose goal is political power. Her 2016 book, A Road Unforeseen, Women Fight the Islamic State, examines the role of Kurdish women as warriors against fundamentalism in Syria and Turkey, what happens to women when fundamentalists like ISIS take over, and the Rojava vision of a non-ethnic, non-religious, egalitarian society where decisions are made locally and democratically. And the book's right over there. Debbie Bookchin is a longtime journalist and author who's won awards for her news, feature, and investigative writing. She's reported for a variety of publications, including the New York Times, The Atlantic, the Boston Globe, and New Scientist. Bookchin's commentaries have appeared in The Nation, Roar Magazine, Vermont Public Radio, and other outlets. She served for 3 years as press secretary to the U.S. Congressman Bernie Sanders when he first assumed office in 1991. She also has the distinct honor of being raised and born in New York City, and the daughter of two activist parents. Her father is the philosopher and social theorist Murray Bookchin, who's credited with originating the critical theory known as social ecology, which is a major impact on the New Left of the 1960s, the alter globalization movement, and more recently the Kurdish autonomy movement, with its anti-capitalist, reconstructive, ecological, and communalist vision of social organization. Her mother, Beatrice Bookchin, worked alongside her father for more than 60 years, contributing to the development of his theoretical ideas and running twice in Burlington, Vermont City Council elections on a radical municipalist platform that would contest the power of the nation state. Many of the ideas that have animated this philosophy and its expression that can be, in the Kurdish autonomous region of northern Syria can be found in Murray Bookchin's latest book of essays, The Next Revolution, Popular Assemblies, and the Promise of Direct Democracy, which Debbie co-edited. So it's my distinct honor to open it up first to Meredith and then to Debbie.
Yeah, can I use her mic? Yep. Okay, like Mia said, we're each just gonna give a little rap, and then we're gonna talk together, and then we're gonna open it up. So, I just wanted to say, as somebody who's been active in the left and the feminist movement since the late 60s, I got interested in the Kurdish movement quite recently during the Battle of Kobani, when I was blown away, and it was clear that something new was happening in terms of women, something that I had never seen before in other revolutionary movements, and that women were unusually visible and unusually powerful, and it wasn't just one. It was a whole, often there's one heroic, guerrilla woman. It's a whole lot of people. And this is a real departure from Marxist tradition in which, as I said, there's usually one or two visible women. and women's oppression is given some recognition, but doing anything about it is often deferred until later, and later keeps receding into the distance because something more important is always needing to be done first. And women are, after all, an adjunct to the main struggle, which is the class struggle, rather than an important struggle in their own right. And the same has been true of national liberation movements that I've observed, where women often have, I mean, the Kurdish women are not the first women guerrillas I've ever seen by any means. There have been many women guerrillas in different struggles, but they often, when the struggle ends, get sent back home again. And even if they remain politically active, they tend to be limited to certain areas of work, which are social rather than economic or military, so that the people who get when the ministers' portfolios are dished out in the new government, it's guys who control the financial stuff, the international stuff usually, the military stuff always, and anything that involves dispensing patronage. And the women control women and children, so they get education, social welfare stuff, portfolios. And, this is a problem because women, again, are being relegated to traditional areas. So how is the Kurdish movement different? And I think that's one of the things we want to talk about today, but just briefly as a little appetizer. The ideology is different. Women are at the center of Öcalan's ideology, blatantly replacing without apology the working class as the carrier of revolution, the agent of revolution. Öcalan says in Liberating Life, the solutions for all social problems in the Middle East should have women's position as focus. The role the working classes once played must now be taken over by the sisterhood of women. I've never even heard any feminists say that in the West. I mean, that's majorly innovative. And it came out of it, not only out of the experience of the Kurdish movement, but out of a critique of previous socialist movements as having devolved into bureaucracy and led not to freedom, but to further subjugation. So one difference is ideological. There are important differences organizationally, mainly dual structures at every level, so that women have their own structures, which can, in certain areas, overrule the mixed or the male structure. Co-chairs of everything, co-leaders, quotas. Now, each of those things by itself is not necessarily totally innovative, but putting them all together, their impact is enormous. And so we talked about ideology, organization, and let's talk about program. There are a number of ways in which the program of the Kurdish movement is different. The first is the emphasis on self-defense, including the development of separate women's armed units, which apparently will remain and are at all levels. It's not just until we defeat ISIS, that's how it's going to be. The second is seeing violence against women as a major social problem that has to be addressed at all levels, prevented and educated, and finding solutions to this. The third is education. There's mandatory education on women's rights at all levels, and not just for women, for men too. And in economics, where the foundation is cooperatives, there are efforts to, have I not been paid? Is this the first time you can hear me? Have you been able to hear me?
No, we can
Okay.
hear you.
Economic co-ops to draw women into socialized production. And the question is often asked, how does Kurdish feminism differ from Western feminism? It's not a good question because there is no such thing as Western feminism. There are a million different kinds of Western feminism. I mean, generational, ideological, depending on where you come from and all that. But that being said, there are some important differences with almost every kind of Western feminism. One is the emphasis on self-defense, and another is a whole constellation of issues around sexuality and free expression, which I hope we can talk about. Now I'm going to hand over to Debbie.
Thank you, Meredith. First of all, I want to say thank you to the organizers of this amazing event.
Me
This
too.
has been 3 days of really wonderful, wonderful conversation, film, culture, and I think that, if you don't mind, I'd like to just ask everybody to give a big hand to the 8 Ball community, and especially who just a remarkable collective of people, and I'm especially grateful to Francis, who has pulled so much of this together, to my colleague Julia Cartel and Nara, and there's too many people to name individually, but I also want to thank all of you for being here. I know that on a Sunday afternoon there's a million things people can be doing, and it's really wonderful to see you all here today. Somebody in the back of the room asked about Meredith Tax, and I would like to talk about Mehmet, but I was asked to do it a little bit later, right before the films on Rojava are going to be shown. Will you be here for that?
Unfortunately not.
Okay, then I'm going to just take 1 minute, literally, and I can't possibly do justice to the person that Mehmet was. For some of you who may have been here on Friday evening and heard his close friend Jiran speak about him, he gave a wonderful long introduction to who Mehmet was. But what I just wanted to say, and I'll talk maybe a little bit more about him later, is that Mehmet was a leader of the Kurdish movement in the United Kingdom and London, and really for much of Western Europe. He was 32 years old when he went to Rojava to, in a certain sense, fulfill his dream to go to the place that he had been born in Kurdistan and moved to London when he was 3 years old. But he went there to really give a voice to the many thousands of people fighting for liberation in Rojava, in the YPG and the YPJ, the defense forces that, as I'm sure most of you know, make up the bulk of the Syrian Democratic Forces. And what I just want to say briefly about Mehmet is, from a very personal level, as a friend of his, is that he is a great inspiration. He was an extraordinary person, a filmmaker, a writer, an editor, a person who just brought everybody around him to feel a deeper sense of humanity because of who he was, because he made time for people, because he was so emotionally generous, because he made you feel like you could really change the world. And he was a great leader, and his death in Raqqa, in a very bizarre kind of almost accidental way, in which he was not actually on the front lines, but was a little bit behind the lines in a YPG camp, sort of, in a working area, but that was infiltrated by the Islamic State, by several Islamic State fighters. He happened to be outside in the wrong place at the wrong time and was shot dead. His death is just an incredible loss to the entire Kurdish diaspora, and to the entire left, because his fundamental belief, like those of really all the Kurds fighting in Syria and also the Kurds in Turkey who have been putting democratic and federalism into practice, was that their fight for autonomy and for liberation was never limited to the Kurdish people, but is really a fight for all humanity. So I'm very honored to be here, and that this festival has been dedicated in his honor. And I hope that as we go forward and talk some more, we can all take away some inspiration from his life. And for those who are going to be here later, we will talk a few more minutes about Mehmet and maybe show a few photos of him, maybe even a short, like a couple of minutes of a film clip about him. So, Mehmet, of course, wasn't the only person who has sacrificed his life for the revolution in Rojava. Thousands and thousands of young men and women have died in this ferocious battle against the barbarism of the Islamic State, against these people who, above all, are particularly cruel and hideous in their relationship to women. And I think that it's important as we look at that whole situation as it's developing in Syria, that we remember that there is a certain sort of almost like a mythology now that's developing about the fighters on the ground in Syria, the Syrian Democratic Forces. And it's just interesting that, for example, recently one of the US major generals gave a press conference and he waxed on and on about the heroism of these people. And everybody sort of, it's very easy to talk about what they're fighting against, and the United States likes to play that up a lot, the US military and State Department. But of course, their heroism isn't some kind of genetic factor. It's actually that they are fighting for something, fighting to preserve something extremely profound. And that is the idea of democratic confederalism. And Meredith, alluded to some of the aspects of that in terms of the way it is specifically empowering to women. And I just wanted to talk a little bit for a few minutes about the background, how it came to be, and sort of what that program really entails on the ground. So, as I'm sure some of you are familiar, the Kurdish leader, Abdullah Öcalan, who has really been the ideological founder of this theory, is in prison right now for life on Imralı Island and in Turkey. And when he was abducted in 1999 and sentenced to life in prison, he began to do a kind of theoretical re-examination of the Kurdish strategy, in a certain sense, for autonomy. And again, one could go into a whole history about the Kurds, but I'm sure most of you know that they are the largest stateless population of about 45 million people, and especially in Turkey and Syria, there was this sense that they had to change tactics and move away from the kind of Marxist idea of seizure of state power, because that had clearly failed on many levels, the Soviet Union being the best example of that, and move to something that would allow people a greater sense of self-determination. Öcalan did a lot of reading. One of the philosophers, social theorists that he came upon, who he was had felt a particular affinity with, was the work of my father, Murray Bookchin, the social theorist, who had been writing, who was known for many years in the United States as an anarchist thinker and theorist, and who had been writing about issues like ecology, and he's sort of known as the founder of social ecology, the idea that we can't change our relationship to the natural world until we change human social relations, that we have to do more than eliminate class issues, class distinctions, and class inequalities, that we won't really be free until we also eliminate hierarchy, patriarchy, domination on every level, whether it's of women by men, of the young by the old. And Öcalan embraced these ideas and felt that this, rather than seeking a separate Kurdish state, as we see, for example, by Barzani in Iraq, that true self-determination really had to happen on the local level. And there's a great, history, there's a great tradition of this, from the Paris Commune to the Spanish anarchist collectives, where people take power in their neighborhoods, in their towns, create collectives, create economic collectives, and actually in this way really fulfill the aspirations of people to have self-determination. And so in the early aughts, Öcalan, sort of helped kind of pivot the entire Kurdish autonomy movement, the Kurdish liberation movement, in this direction, and began to write about this, and also began to ask, a lot of my father's books happened to be in Turkish, and began to ask the mayors of many cities and towns in Turkey, in the southeast, where the Kurds are particularly prevalent, to read some of these books about cities and municipalism, and began to start to build these structures so that when the Syrian war began in 2011, and when Assad pulled his troops kind of out of the area known as Rojava, the largely Kurdish area along the northeast of Syria, really the Kurds were kind of ready. They had been reading, studying, and starting to even underground to create these kinds of councils. And as Meredith said, what they did was they put into place a kind of a council democracy in which at the neighborhood level, people meet in face-to-face community assemblies, and they delegate, they make decisions, they discuss, they debate, they try and reach consensus. In some cases, decisions are made by consensus. In some cases, they're made by vote. And then they delegate representatives to the next level. And in this way, in the 3 cantons that are considered the cantons of Rojava, there is a sense that people are really engaged in self-determination, and they are really making the decisions for their cities and towns. And I think that, you know, one of the important things that I would like, and I'm going to conclude in a minute so we can have a conversation with all of you, that I would like the left in the United States, or not just the left, but anybody who really cares about democracy, who cares about freedom, to take away from the Rojava model is just how important it is to really build organization. One of the reasons that I put together this selection of essays by my father called The Next Revolution was because I was trying to sort of speak to the sort of left, the progressives in this country about how we can organize in a way that is not simply protest, you know, being on the streets, which is great and important, but and not also just going into a voting booth and pressing that lever, you know, hoping for the lesser of evils, that kind of politics, but actually a third way, which is building organizations on the local level, emulating what they are doing in Rojava right now, and slowly actually creating a counter force to the power of the nation state, which is exactly what they are doing in Rojava, because the idea is not to create a new nation state with all that bureaucracy, with all that unfreedom that comes from, you know, centralized government, but to actually break down and decentralize that power and bring it back to people where it really belongs. So I'll end with that. And
You can keep it.
Why don't you hold on to that?
Yeah, why don't you hold on to that? Well, so let's just actually go a little bit deeper into that point specifically. So I'd like to hear, you know, what do you all understand as the state? And how is it attached to ethnic or national identity? And what does it mean to not become a state?
Wow, that's a big one.
That's a big one.
I mean, I'm not a political scientist and I can't cite theory. When I was growing up, people talk, you know, from the Wobblies, the state is the executive committee of the ruling class. That's a little oversimplified, but there's something to it. But mostly in my lifetime, I have seen the state very closely aligned with nationalism. And in the United States, in fact, one theorist, John Gray, has even said nationalism is the real religion of the United States. And we are certainly now seeing that come fully into the light with the Trump administration. But if you look back at what happened with the breakup of the Eastern Bloc, with the breakup of Yugoslavia, with all these strongly nationalist movements that suddenly start breaking up everything, they are extremely focused on their neighbor, their next door neighbor, who is the enemy. And this has happened all over the world. And it's not necessarily a state, it could be a tribe, it could be anything, but it's hierarchical and it's ethnic or nationalist. And that's been the main trend in world politics that I have seen since 1989. And the theory developed by Öcalan and carried out in Rojava is very much saying that this is not the way to go. If we look at this, he says, look at the states we have. Do you want to live in any of them? Is this the way we should be living? You know, where democracy is pretty much paper, where there are elites who are in control of everything and are corrupt and have all the money, and tell everybody else what to do. This is not progress. This is not what we meant by socialism. This is this is not the way to go. We have to find a different way, and it may not entail having our own state. Maybe having our own state is a step backwards rather than a step forwards. And we have to find some other method, which he frames very much in terms of, let's just bypass the state. I mean, we can't get rid of the Turkish state. We can't get rid of the Syrian state. We don't have the power. Let's just hope that we can form other kinds of relations from the ground up, start working confederally across borders, and maybe, I mean, he doesn't say the state will wither away. I've never yet seen that happen. But you can see that that's kind of in the back of his mind.
And I'll just add to that, you know, Öcalan talks about the state as sort of promoting a single national culture, a single national identity, a single often religion, as we see in Turkey now, you know, and actually even in the United States, the Christian, you know, United States. And by contrast, the idea of democratic confederalism is it's multi-ethnic, it's you know, democratic, it's the idea of bringing power back to people, it's flexible, it's anti-monopolistic. I mean, you know, the state also retains a monopoly on violence, and we see that even just in a place that's supposedly democratic like Spain, where the Catalan separatists were just subjected to the most brutal kind of police force. So when I think of the state, you know, I think of really the handmaiden also of capitalism, because it's the state that enforces the social relations that lead to capitalism. And I think that, you know, it's difficult to talk about where Rojava may go in terms of, I mean, right now, as Meredith said, people are talking about staying within existing state borders, having some level of autonomy. In my father's philosophy, what he called libertarian municipalism or communalism, he believed that if people could start to run for local office, not regional and national office, but local office, on a real platform that was very much, again, this sort of democratic and federalist platform, the idea that they would not be candidates representing people, but delegates based on conversations, on figuring out exactly what a program would be, that if they could be elected to city councils, that those city councils, as they became more and more radicalized, could actually start to subvert the power of the nation state, and that it would slowly, I don't want to use the word wither away, but that it could be dismantled bit by bit as more and more power was taken over by localities.
I mean, so I think this kind of speaks to, you know, what do you think we can learn from the democratic project or experience in Rojava? Are there parallels that we can draw also from the kind of feminist project in Rojava for our efforts here?
I think we can learn a lot of the same things from looking at things in our own history of the United States that we can look at in Rojava. And I want to talk particularly about SNCC, which was a leading organization in the civil rights movement, which did a lot of the same things that they're doing in Rojava. It had local, I mean, they didn't call them assemblies, but local meetings. It had engaged in direct civil disobedience with the state. It tried to participate in the electoral process, although it was pretty much closed out. And basically it ran, you know, huge numbers of educational grassroots things, teaching people everything from how to read to how to do algebra to politics, and drawing from their own experience. And it was not a pacifist movement. I mean, it was not a movement for armed struggle either, but people were living in clan country, and they had guns, and they recognized that they could not, you know, start an armed rebellion, but they had to defend themselves, and did on occasion, although on more occasions they got killed. And it's very important to study the history of SNCC, which is what started so many other 60s movements, and which was really started by a woman who taught the younger kids, Ella Baker, a lot of this democratic stuff that she had worked out in her own lifetime of experience as an organizer in Harlem and in the South. And all of these ideas are, and you know, another part of these ideas, which are in Rojava and also in other kinds of democratic grassroots organizing, are providing services, providing health care, providing ways to escape domestic abuse, providing various kinds of educational things. Those things could all be done tomorrow. They could be done in your neighborhood, they could be done in mine. I mean, one of the big obstacles in New York is lack of free space you could use, but we could all decide to start an adult education program tomorrow in some church or storefront, and it would eventually have the kind of impact that SNCC did if it spread. So it's more a question of thinking about politics in a way that's not stereotyped, that as Debbie said, emphasizes organization and learning from the people and working directly with the people. And part of the problem with the US left is it's too cut off from regular people. It's too much a group of, you know, people who think all the time and don't do anything but go to protests. Anyway, that's a stereotype too. I'll shut up now.
You know, I would say that one of the things to me that's been really exciting in recent years, kind of that has slowly been emerging out of, you know, since our time in Occupy, for example, is that people are recognizing that we need to build, that we need to institutionalize some of the structures that have been sort of informally in place. I mean, all over the country now, there are all kinds of alternative food co-ops and child care and, you know, housing rights organizations, and these things are all very important. I think, you know, alternative movements and expressions of sort of this desire to create an alternative to you know, capitalist modernity, just to use a broad phrase. But what I think is important is that, and we saw this, for example, in New York, since I know we're many of us here New Yorkers, with Occupy Sandy, you know, after the huge superstorm Sandy, when the state really fell down on the job, just as it's doing everywhere else right now, you know, in Puerto Rico and everywhere else. The people can mobilize themselves. I think the important thing is to start to give institutional legs to these efforts and to coordinate them. And you know, Meredith mentioned SNCC, and one of the things one example that I'd point people to that you can Google is the work that's being undertaken in Jackson, Mississippi by the organization Cooperation Jackson. And they've been working, and this didn't just pop up out of nowhere. You know, they've been working for 40 years in their community, getting to know people, working on local issues, setting up economic cooperatives. And they've just recently, again, actually, elected a mayor, you know, who is representative of that organization. So I'd like to feel that it's hopeful that we can do the same thing here. I mean, you know, for me, one of the takeaways from this festival is, of course, I want people to support Rojava, and they desperately need our support, desperately, because, you know, Lord only knows what's going to happen once the Trump administration considers the Islamic State vanquished, you know, and what kind of deals they'll be making with Assad. But one of the things that the people that I talk to from Rojava also say over and over again is, we need you. You're in the West. You're in the power center. We need you to start creating these kinds of organizations to help bring you know, this notion of self-determination as a true possibility to fruition.
So I want to get back to this question of what we can do, but I want to go to one more question first, which is, and you kind of mentioned this with Operation Jackson, and I know that they have examples of preparedness that include being armed and or understanding how to use arms. And I think that, you know, what is kind of remarkable about what we saw, or what we've seen in Rojava in terms of women being a huge part of the armed front is kind of like, you know, how is that how is that different from the role of armed struggle and the ideology of the Kurdish women's movement? Like, what ways is it similar to other examples of armed liberation struggles with women in front, and how is it different? And what can we take away from that as people who tend to be more pacifist and or unskilled when it comes to armed struggle?
I think, we have to look at the particular circumstances of that struggle and how it arose from a situation of armed struggle initially in Turkey and then developed farther in Rojava with the fight against ISIS. But long before that, women were asserting themselves within the PKK in Turkey, and a lot of the same ideas and the same kind of practice were transferred to Rojava when the opportunity arose, because there were always many Syrian Kurds in the PKK as well. And the PKK was founded as a guerrilla movement based on Marxist ideas of people's war, and the classic kind of, you go to the mountains, you fight a protracted struggle, eventually you surround the cities and you take over. Only it didn't work because there was a military coup before they got very far. And they remained in the mountains and remained trying to fight for many years without actually getting very far. And meanwhile, a civilian movement developed among Kurds who had been pushed, because of the armed struggle, had been pushed into the cities where they were living in very, very bad conditions and were very oppressed. And they started developing a civil resistance, and they also started developing a political movement, a political party movement where they would run for office. And the parties have had many names because they kept being closed down by the Turkish government. And the current one is the KDP. So, HDP, oh God, sorry about that. Thank you, Debbie. Anyway, bad mistake. So these three different kinds of struggle developed and inevitably influenced each other. And women started going to the mountains to become part of the guerrilla struggle in great numbers in the 90s. And we also have to see this as part of a worldwide upsurge of women during the 90s, which resulted in many UN conferences and ended in the Beijing conference, which passed a whole program about women's rights that was supposed to apply everywhere. And in fact, there were people there from Kurdistan who brought some of those ideas and examples back. So this has always been in dialogue, although a rather weak one, because people couldn't go back and forth that much, with the rest of the world. So women began to assert themselves as they got into the army, and they, of course, were treated the way women are at first in any situation, which is, what are you doing here? What do you know about fighting? Go wash the dishes, kind of thing. And they stood up to that repeatedly. And they also were one of the main initiators of examining the policy of military struggle alone, because the classic go to the mountains guerrilla model is, you fight and you fight and you fight, and eventually you win, and you don't really have to do that much else. And they were saying, look at the stuff that's going on in the cities. There's more to do besides just fight. We can't rely only on military stuff. And there were big struggles about this within the PKK. And Öcalan, because he's very smart and also was questioning these ideas, sided with the women. So you had the situation, as a young woman told me, that here you come up against the glass ceiling. You're trying to say what women need in your job, in the left, wherever, and you come up against obstacles that you just can't get past. But there, the same forces that were pushing up, as these forces were pushing up from below, you had somebody on the top trying to break the glass ceiling. And basically, I can't name names, but I'm sure he was not supported by all the men in leadership. And in fact, there were splits after this, after he got sent to jail. So women became a very strong force in the party and in the guerrilla movement, and they wanted their own units because they were being patronized constantly and told they couldn't do anything, and they lacked confidence. So you would have men at one hand saying, you know, you're no good at this, go back to the kitchen. You're too little, you can't lift the heavy weapons, you know, you just aren't, this isn't the right thing for you to be doing. And you would have women saying, well, I'm not really so good at this, you know, I don't really feel confident. And they needed to be in a situation where they could learn how to be powerful. And they didn't it wasn't separatist, but it was autonomous in the same way autonomy is a theme throughout the movement. And so gradually they formed their own militias and they formed their own army. And the theory is that women in a very traditional society like this, and you have to remember that the Kurdish peoples are not that different from the other peoples in the Middle East in terms of the traditional ways of treating women, which involve child marriage, honor killings, FGM, seclusion in the home, that they had to make a complete break with this. Leave their families, go to the mountains, become warriors in order to become a different kind of person. And only this different kind of woman would be able to lead the struggle. So I think I'll hand over.
I'll just say something about the question of violence and tactics in this country. You know, I appreciate, you know, as I'm sure you know, the whole various neo-Nazi movements that have been going on, and there's been within the left discussion about what kind of reaction, whether it should be a violent reaction to them, whether we should engage in dialogue. And I can certainly appreciate that when people are out on the street demonstrating, you know, trying to express their point of view, and I'm talking about our people, progressive people, that if you're attacked by a bunch of neo-Nazis, it's great to have the black bloc there to protect you. What I want to raise as a point of caution, however, is that, you know, often there is a tendency, or there can be certain parts of the anarchist movement that sort of glorifies this kind of activity. You know, isn't it great? We're out there in force, we're smashing bank windows, we're sort of what my generation used to call way back in the smashing the state, you know. And as somebody who has lived through several decades of this kind of protest, I really feel that we have to acknowledge that it's extremely limited, that it really doesn't create the organizations we need. You know, my father talked about this back in the 60s. He said, we've got to organize. We can't just protest. We've got to create alternative institutions. And so my concern with the question of violent tactics or, you know, armed struggle is to be quite blunt, you know, I just don't think there's any place for it in this country. I mean, this state, this government of ours in Washington, D.C., really controls the means of violence and can do anything it wants to us. And so I think we have to look for a kind of a democratic program, something, and also, frankly, I really wonder how many people are inspired, how many of the people that we're trying to reach are inspired by people who rampage through their streets and just smash windows, you know? Does it give them a sense of empowerment? I mean, the hard work that we have to do is we have to go and we have to talk to people. We have to meet them in their communities. We have to bring them along. We have to talk about what real freedom means, you know, not just getting a $15 wage, which would be certainly great for a lot of people, but the idea that we create societies in which people can express their creativity, societies that are rational, societies that are ecological. And so to me, I think it's very dangerous to sort of glorify armed struggle, especially in the 21st century, that we have to work through democratic means and slowly bring people to our point of view.